I'm Evan Snyder from the Burnham Institute. I'm the director of the program in developmental and regenerative cell biology, or nicknamed the Stem Cell and Regeneration Program. I also represent the Southern California Stem Cell Consortium, which is a confederation of investigators in the Southern California region who are very interested in this biology. I think there are many, many questions that puzzle me and everybody else that is in stem cell biology. And that's sort of why I felt I personally needed a group like this. So getting a group of scholars together, gathered here, debating issues has been my dream for a very long time. In fact, it was a dream that I had even all my years back at Harvard. And when I came here, I was fortunate enough to partner with Larry and Mike and Sarah and Andrea, as well as other fellow stem cell biologists like Rusty Gage and Larry Goldstein, and partner with other ethicists like Bill Herbert and Lou Gennin, all of whom had a similar vision that we really need to debate these issues in a very rigorous, open manner. And now I think we have some of the smartest people that I know in the world here in this room to debate this issue. Now, the title, as you're going to hear, is not ideal. You know, when does human life begin? That's not ideal, and I've been told that by almost everybody that we've invited. But it does reflect the fact of what we wanted to achieve here. We talked about, can biologic, legal, and ethical definitions converge? Well, it reflects the idea that we want to be multidisciplinary. We want to be precise. We want to be rigorous. And the Southern California Stem Cell Consortium, for those of that you don't know, is based on 3 pillars. Obviously, one pillar is the science. The other is education and training and bioethics and public policy. And I sort of see an event like this as merging at least 2 of these pillars. One, we need to work out the issues. But 2, and that's why so many scientists are invited here, this is meant to educate the scientists, like myself, like the other people in the program, and to be educated by people who have done this carefully for their entire lives. What the scientists are meant to be here are as students, and what I wanted to try to emphasize to my fellow scientists is that ethics, or doing ethics the right way, is not simply taking your emotional temperature. It really is a rigorous enterprise, much akin to science itself, testing hypotheses, having points of debate. And I think as Francis Cam and Father Nicanor are going to point out, there is a truth out there in science, in ethics, and our job is to try to find it. We may not, but we try to get to as close an approximation of truth as possible. And where the approximations are, that's where we debate, or that's where we try to find consensus. So that's going to be one aspect. Now, I've been told by those in the ethics community, like Paul Lorenzen and Laurie Zoloth and Larry Schneiderman, that they've been doing this for a really, really long time, and that they've reached certain consensus among themselves. Well, what I want to do is take advantage of their expertise, because there are a whole lot of new people entering this debate right now. There's new science, there's new lessons to learn, and we're here to learn from them. And as Larry Goldstein said last night, let's at least take 5 hours to bash away at it and see what we can do. So hopefully we're all going to be students here. And even if we can't define where life begins, or where personhood begins, as Lou Gennin is going to point out, at least as Bill Herbert and I are trying to do, we can define where personhood is not. And perhaps that will define areas where we can operate, areas where we can reach consensus. And consensus is something that, that Laurie and Jeff and Larry and Mike Shapiro have been working on and trying to work out for a while. And the only thing I want to emphasize is that when we talk, either from the floor, from the podium, from the panel, that we do as Rusty Gage urged us to do last night, that when we make an argument, when we make a point, that we simply say, is it based on evidence, based on interpretation, or based on belief, so that we know where our arguments are coming from. So we may have come into this room labeling ourselves or being labeled as pro this or con this or conservative or liberal. What I'm hoping, however, is that we're going to leave this room as a community of scholars that feel comfortable debating and arguing with each other, hopefully to come back periodically over the years, and that we will define where we agree, where we disagree, and that these are areas that we can work within, that we can debate. So as Larry Hinman's going to point out, arguments are not bats to beat up your opponent with. What they are meant to figure out areas where we reside on a particular issue and where the basis of our disagreements are, and figure out whether those are amenable to resolution. So what I urge is that whatever is said here today, that it be said with intelligence, with rigor, with precision, and most importantly, with respect for everybody else and every other person's point of view. Because as I said, in this room, regardless of what the points of view are, I think we have some of the smartest people in the world from the most diverse backgrounds to be able to work out some of these particular issues. And I'm really quite confident that when people this smart, people of goodwill get together, that we will make some progress. And most importantly, to figure out, as Mike Shapiro pointed out yesterday, what do we do when we can't get to the truth, when we can't get to the right answer? Then what do we do and how do we proceed? And I think that's going to be very important. So with that, I'm going to turn the program first over to Larry Hinman, who's going to give an introduction to non-cognoscenti like ourselves in the concept of moral reasoning. And then Larry will turn the program over to Mike Kalichman, who will launch the program, talk about the logistics of how it will proceed, and then launch onto the program. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Evan, for those particularly helpful words, I think, about what ethics is about and the role of argument in ethical discourse. Originally, when we planned this, we talked about a 20-minute primer for the Non Cognoscenti on what ethics is. We're going to do it in 3, okay? We are already 1 minute behind. I hope when I finish we will be 4 minutes behind. Let me, by the way, also make a point that there is the possibility of reaching agreement in ethics, and we've already seen that in the widespread agreement that the title for this conference is not the best possible title that we could come up with. So we're already on track in terms of achieving some degree of agreement. I want to say 3 things, basically. First of all, I want to say a little bit about what ethics is and is not. Secondly, I want to say a couple words about 2 principal types of ethical frameworks that you will see time and again as our discussions proceed today. And I hope that what that will do is to provide you with a context within which to situate the particular arguments that you encounter. And then finally, I'd like to say a few words about the role of disagreement in ethics. Much of what I want to say about what ethics is and is not, Evan has already said quite well. Ethics is not simply, as he said, taking your emotional temperature or gut level reactions, though those may play an important role as the first step in a process that eventually leads to more reasoned reflection. But one thing that I would emphasize here is that ethics is not simply a reflection, but it is a communal reflection on the ways in which we together are going to face these, at times, rather daunting issues that we are presently encountering. And what that reasoned reflection tries to do is to address the question of how we can live together. The role of argument within that is not, as Evan has said, to be, a cudgel that you sort of hit people over the head with, but rather the role of argument, which is often precise, painstaking, and detailed. The role of argument is precisely to map out the territory between ourselves and others as clearly as possible so that we can see both for ourselves how the pieces fit within our own views and how they fit for other people, and that communal aspect of argument, I think, is something that we will see time and again as we proceed this afternoon. Second point I want to make is about just two basic frameworks in ethical reasoning. I will now summarize an approximately 400-page book that I did in a slightly over 1 page. So it will be a little, for those of you who are philosophers, you can just rest, okay? Ethical theories, broadly speaking, insofar as they address the question of how we ought to act, fall into two categories. On the one hand, consequentialist theories, and on the other hand, what I'll call rule-based theories. Consequentialist theories and utilitarianism, which you've probably heard a fair amount about, is one version of these, but not the only, maintain that the answer to the question of how we ought to act is to be found by looking at consequences. Which course of action will produce the best consequences? Okay? Now, consequentialists, as we'll see, disagree among themselves about almost everything, about how we measure consequences, how long their duration, who does the measuring, all that kind of thing. But what they all have in common is the deep-seated conviction that consequences are what make something right or wrong. And I think this is at once a deeply empirical moral theory in that it really demands that we look at the way the world actually works. And secondly, it's one driven by a highly understandable motive, namely to actually change the world, to make it a better place. Whether one agrees or disagrees with it, that's, I think, what that type of reasoning is at its best. In contrast to that, we'll see another type of reasoning throughout today's talks and discussions, and that's what I'd call rule-based moral reasoning. And what's characteristic of that is that those who are in this tradition maintain that the answer to the question of how ought we to act is to be found by seeing whether certain actions conform or violate particular rules. Now, once again, there will be a wide range of disagreement about what those rules might be, whether it be the golden rule, whether it be rules of justice, of human rights, of the social contract, what have you. There's a lot of disagreement there. But where rule-based theorists come together is on a single point, at least, and that is that consequences, no matter how desirable, don't trump the rules. You can't torture someone because in the end you'll get the information that will save more lives. There are certain rules that are themselves inviolable. Okay? So you'll see both of those general types of ethical reasoning going on today. The final point that I'd like to make is simply about ethical disagreement, because sometimes it looks as though on any given issue, if you have 3 people, you've got 4 positions at least. I want to say something about the spirit of this. I think it's unhelpful to look upon ethical disagreements as sort of disagreements between, on the one hand, people who are benevolent and smart, and on the other hand, people who are sort of stupid and ill-willed, My own experience has been that there's a pretty equal distribution of both on all sides of issues, and that in deep ethical disagreements, what we find is that they're smart, benevolent people on all sides of the issues. That's precisely why they're deep and difficult issues, They're not no-brainers, And when we encounter such disagreements, I think the first step is to realize that intelligent people of goodwill are on various sides of the issues, including sides that you are opposed to, and that the first step in making progress on this communal undertaking of ethical reasoning is to begin by listening to one another. That said, I'm going to turn the podium over to one of these smart, benevolent people, Laurie Zoloft, as our first speaker. Thank you very much.
This is an exercise in mutual trust, because not only did Glenn say he couldn't do it, and so that meant reshifting what needed to be said, I had a very different plan for what I was going to talk about. And people who know me and have heard me speak before know that I like long poetic talks that are all crafted and where every word is all sort of written down, ready. And this isn't, and I'm not a big fan of PowerPoint. But Jeff and I decided that we would take up the challenge laid down by our hosts and make a working conference, work in progress, open to anything thing happen here. And so therefore, you're going to see some thoughts about my ideas about moral status, a lot of typos, and a lot of flaws in an argument. So, but it's going to be some new ideas, and which is a good thing for an Orthodox feminist Jewish scholar to try. So trust me that I will make errors, and that I know that some things I'm trying are just floats, and that I trust you not to think I'm a complete fool. So there you go. So I want to begin with this idea about moral status and what does that mean. And I want to push out the idea of pluripotency in a world that is itself pluripotent and alarmingly and lovelily contingent. So is it possible to say when human life begins? And I'm so tempted to now walk off the podium at this point. Almost, right? Just like, no, it's not. It's not. And the second question, a postcolon question, can the ethical and legal and biological conception of the human embryo converge? And notice did they notice how funny that was? And did they notice that the reason that the answer to this could be yes, but so what, has to do with they left out religion. You see? So like the lawyers and philosophers and the biologists really probably could make up something here. But for those of us who also study and not tangentially believe in faith traditions and the interpreted communities of textual scholars that surround those faiths, it matters that religion is not a part of this discourse. Can we determine moral status then, given those two constraints? And I think it's a long maybe, and that's what's going to follow here. So first of all, this is my Los Angeles birth question, the Rodney King question for Southern Californians. Why can't we all get along, right? Well, we have tried. We've really tried to think about when life begins. It is not a new problem, and Jeff is going to talk to you some about why it's a lot like our ongoing struggle in bioethics to determine death. It's what we call a moral boundary problem. Who's in and who's out, and for 2,000 or 3,000, depending, or 5,764 years, depending on how you're counting, in moral philosophy and in religious studies, this has been an interesting problem that many, many people have worked on. Almost any argument that we could come up with, Larry, wherever you are, in this room, guess what? In those last several thousand years, probably has been said by someone, and someone could find a text from which to pull an answer. It's not to say it's not always good to try, but we come on ground that has been heavily crossed by many important paths. And Jeff will say more about the regulatory history of the last 30 years. Faith traditions, as you know, had to decide. The final question is, when do we bury the person? And for many people here who do anthropology and ask the question of when humanity begins as a species, the answer that many paleoanthropologists will say is when they started to ritually bury people, a thing that human primates do that is unique to human primates. Right? The ritual burial. So the question of when you ritually bury becomes an question for being a human person, for being a human primate. Therefore, it's a faith tradition of great importance. The issue of is the child that has been born a child or a miscarriage is, especially for Jews, but for many other traditions, important. What happened to the woman, and is she back in the community after having given birth or back into the community after a late period? And those questions have been important questions on the table for quite the long time. For medical researchers, we had to know about dead bodies and about embryos when we began to think about could we use them. So the brain death criteria in Harvard were established largely when transplantation became an issue and we needed to know about harvesting organs. And the embryo considerations for science and the regulations that Jeff is going to talk about become an issue when we could begin to rethink what one could do with embryo research. Is a respectful nod to history, and even that is surrounded by a context. In America, there is an ethics of memory that haunts these questions, of course in the Civil War, of course for women in the 19th Amendment, of course for the Shoah, the Holocaust, and of course for Roe versus Wade. We understand the issue of human life and its status as core to these. And the ethics of clinical research actually put forward after the Holocaust an important notation that grounded modern bioethics itself. Human life is inviolate. Human research rests on the ability of the sentient person to say no, even when that no-saying self is not regarded as fully human by the people who want to use her. And that, against all logic, against all of the impressive German science, against the power of a modern state, the codes of regulation enshrined the ability of the core self to say no. So this is a question that we have been struggling with in bioethics. I might say, as a small aside, it's not a particularly interesting Jewish question. And as a Jewish philosopher, I just have to say, I'm here, I'm in, I'll do my job. But if for Jews and for Muslims and for Buddhists, there are other core questions about the ethical considerations about justice and about suffering and about social obligations between sentient beings that make this not the core question. Not the core question, but that's a topic, a slideshow for another conference. I just wanted to mention it so you would know that is not my primary interest in stem cells. The interest here, as Francis Campbell will talk about, is based on the notion of the self, which is itself based in a liberal theory of the state, which emerges from the fine philosophers in the classic philosophical tradition about states, which themselves derive from Greek ideas about citizens and who they are, and how we count them, and what the being of a being is. It also derives from modern philosophy the notion of rational discourse, which means that emotive appeals are not centralized, but rational discourse is, hence, the importance of sentience. It also derives to some extent from Heideggerian accounts of beings as beings in time and beings as beings in context. The notion here is that citizens are equal under laws, we are under laws, and we're under the law in some sort of hierarchical manner. Therefore, status matters. It is also a resonant question, therefore it's far from liberal theory, which is why it's so tantalizing and exciting, because it has to do with our favorite issues to think about: blood and sex and power and fate and suffering, which are, of course, the religious issues of the confrontation between paganism and faith traditions, and of course our much more favorite thing of science fiction. These issues of blood and of faith and of suffering and of women's bodies are the very terms of Western and I think largely Christian thought. And that's why stem cell research is by its essence destabilizing when it's taken, when it focuses on this issue of moral status, because it takes into account conception and its immaculation or maculation, the notion of suffering and death and resurrection. Now stay with me here, because notice that I keep pulling away in a very religious studies manner from this moral status issue to other things, these big things that haunt the debate. In America, the issue of moral status has dominated the way we think not only about the self, but the self in historical context. And after the Civil War, the American pragmatists, and I'm thinking of the James brothers and not the criminals, the James brothers of pragmatism, and Piers and others, thought that we had shed too much blood around the issue of moral status and decided that we could not agree easily on issues of moral status because it was a faith tradition. It has significant differences. It has a history of dissent. Americans historically disagree, and violently, I might add, about moral status issues. Post-Civil War, American philosophic pragmatism evolved from the failure to find a coherent ideology and from the realization that there often was no null position, that in fact predating the issue of is there a liberal solution whatsoever. Moral status is, with other liminalities, consistent with our uncertainty about boundaries in an immigrant nation. We're concerned because our classic texts that I read and I love of Greek and Hellenistic traditions do not account for women, have an odd relationship to slaves, are uncertain about moral status of immigrants, for instance. We've struggled about what a dying person is and what a minimally conscious person is, and just briefly, the classic cases in bioethics that push the envelope is not the issue of embryos, but the issue of, is this a baby K or is this Stephanie Hurrell? The issue of, this is the name of the anencephalic child that people struggled with trying to figure out what status an anencephalic child had, and it went back and forth quite radically. Let me make one contention about moral status and one set of arguments to put for you. The question of moral status, I believe, the question of being, the notion of a being in time, implies a being in not time. A being is linked to the non-beingness. That means that the fundamental issue of being is non-being. That means that it is not only about birth and babies, it is about death. And our struggle for being is intrinsic to the tension that we feel when we see human embryonic stem cell research. Two sorts of questions, just briefly, in ethics. One, of course, definitions and norms, and the other, policy and legal issues that emerge from our decision about this. How do we know what we know? And when you hear the other speakers and the challenges to our talk, remember that everything that counts as a truth claim will have to be proved as a truth claim. And it's not that necessarily because someone argues that a truth claim is a truth claim, that it is a truth claim, if you follow what this philosopher is trying to say. Because the language of truth is itself contended. How do we define it? Suffering, life, or goodness? Who is the we that defines it in any case? Then Jeff will talk more about normative policies. If we could actually choose a truth claim, then what would follow from this sort of analysis? Back to the origins about moral status of the blastocyst, and I'm going to say that it's two issues: the essential nature of the cells and then our duties toward the blastocyst. Now I'm going to try to relink what I had just delinked in terms of philosophic debate. Well, first of all eggs come from a particular woman. There are no anonymous eggs. There are no metaphysical eggs. There's only particular eggs. I have some sisters, you have some others, right? That fact is an actual fact of our biology. Eggs in this sense, as sperm are alive in that they are different from a microphone. Right? So that's one of the issues we have to start with. Eggs are each potentially fertilizable. Bridget Hovind has taught me that, in fact, when life begins is a complicated sort of question. And when I teach undergraduates, I make them take a piece of paper, which you too can do, rip this out, audiovisual egg, take a piece of paper, and Bridget Hogan taught me that, what is this, right? And what happens when it is folded, which is when it begins. What has it become now? And at what point does it become, wait, I have my audiovisual aids, either a hat or a paper airplane or a puzzle. You have to be a girl to make these. Or a piece of paper that is discarded or can be burned. If I was a Buddhist, I say in my classes, I could light this and the beingness of the paper would ultimately mean it is smoke. Its essence, its telos is smoke. And that's what's complicated about the beginningness. Is this a hat? Or is this a paper airplane? And that's our struggle here. Moral status is always contended ground. It is always related to these many and other ideas: biological individuality, level of organization, temporality, reasons, physical location, its potential, or its rates of loss. All of these issues, you smart people know and have made arguments that it is about one of these things. And the truth of the matter is, it's a complex set of things, all of which involve any one of these arguments. There is an ancient tradition in looking at this question to have what's called the unformed fetus. People will talk more about this. Lewis can tell us a lot about the Aristotelian, Augustinian, Aquinian, Thomasian version of this. The Vatican held this position until 1859. It was a part of canon law through 1917. And in Hebrew scriptures, and in Talmudic discourse, and in Sharia law, the idea that the fetus is unformed for 40 days and more akin to water than anything human-like, with concomitant moral status, was the opinion of most of the discourse in religious studies. So let me follow that argument. The moral status of the blastocyst is created in vitro is that it is an entirely unique but human entity that is not the moral equivalent of a human person. That's my claim, based on what I just told you was the religious consensus up until the mid-1800s. It is, in fact, derived from human gametes, which makes it important and acquires it to it some dignity and respect. It is not nothing, it is a human, but it has an equivalent status to gametes. It may or may not have the potential to become a human person. It's impossible to know with any one individual gamete what its fate will be. I'm looking for my other visual aid, which I can't find here. Even if we assume, though, if you could find a woman, and I think Francis Cameron is going to play this out, if we could find a woman or a thing like a woman with a womb to take on the duty to take the blastocysts into her body, this being the actual world, we may or may not have yet a person at the end of that. Pregnancy being what it really is, right? Even if we could assign each one of the frozen embryos we have to a woman, and if each one of us could say, yes, I am going to take them in, even if that could be the case, which, by the way, it is not, and it, I would argue, ought not be the case, these entities are still contingent. Second argument along these lines is that moral status is developmental. Highly regarded developmental arguments in Jewish and Islamic and Buddhist texts. The distinction comes from distinctions in pregnancy, which is the template for all moral status arguments up until recently. That being the only place one found embryos was in pregnant women. The biblical text begins with the issue of harm. If two men fight and a pregnant woman is injured, is harm done, and what's the compensation? If the woman is hurt physically, then it's life for a life, that a life has been taken. If just a miscarriage ensues at any stage undefined of the pregnancy, it's a matter of a loss of some property, and there is a monetary exchange, but there's no criminal punishment for the act, only a civil one. And that biblical text is the only time that it's in the Hebrew Scriptures and in the Sharia law, which references it, and as Lewis will tell us, in the early texts where this thing is mentioned biblically. The other place it happens, the moral status is developmental, is because the rabbinic and the Islamic clerics examined miscarriages for form because of the important thing about when a woman could come back into the community and what sorts of rituals did she need. That meant that every single, and to this day in the Orthodox community, every single issue from a woman's body that has any question about its meaning and its nature is sent to a rabbi to be examined. This still happens right here in San Diego, and therefore there was an acute understanding of embryology at all stages. The idea of quickening was one of the other things that happens when a child inside could be felt outside by the community, also counted. Fetus, up until birth, was seen as a part of the maternal body. And even a month after birth, in classic Jewish law and in many other religious traditions, if a child dies, they are not given full burial rites and rituals. You do not sit Shiva on a child under 1 month of age, because that child has an indeterminate moral status, derivative, their life was derivative yet of the maternal body. Thirdly, moral status is relative to duty. At stake, unlike American law, as Michael will tell us about, is the self is not a bundle of rights, but a bundle of duties. There is a correlative relationship between these rights and duties. Every moral appeal, then, that could be made by the self is only real relative to the call of some other in need. Therefore, the issues of justice and healing absolutely cannot be decoupled from moral status issues, nor from the context of actual women in actual lives. Fourth, we have come to a change, and that change is the taking out from the maternal body of this being. And therefore, the context for this debate we have today is not the body of the woman and the textual interpretive texts that surround that, not the pregnancy within a narrative of relationships, but an artifice, an external contingent matter. We are not our DNA, and in fact, you and I are the surround of each entity. Each blastocyst in the lab has not a woman's body to protect it in the textual world that we come from in religious and philosophical studies. It is as if each one of us sits right here, right now, in the middle of this room with these blastocysts, and we surround them. And we need to figure out what our context and our duties are, and what does that mean? It's the shocking idea of the decoupling of essential narratives. And this idea is the notion of the self and fate that molecular biology profoundly challenges. Ethics, which responds by narrative and principle in cases, struggles with this idea. There are 4 things that trouble our normal categories when we think about the moral self and the moral beginnings of self. There is this notion of an idea of an intact self that we can't cling to right now. For Greeks, knowing was making, but for Americans, knowing is unmaking. And the world is unraveled. It's a California metaphor. It's like the Hewlett-Packard guys with all the parts in the garage on the floor, and we're not sure how we're going to put it back together. Molecular biologists, you know this is true. You've got all the pieces. You've got the thing looked at. I don't know how you're going to put it back together. Ted Friedman, when it tells me to remind everybody, it might not entirely work. We don't know if the promise will come to pass. If we did, it wouldn't really be science. I have high hopes because I'm an optimistic, cheery sort, but in fact, the pieces are on the garage floor. The world is reduced to atoms. This podium, this microphone, this self is atoms. And that creates an alienation and an instability that, if you think of it, is profound. You could put your hand right through that table you're sitting in front of. And where is the self in a world? What is the authentic self when we make an artifice that is a stem cell that does not exist, by the way, in nature? Where are the borders? Second big problem with why we fail is this self exists in nature, and I'm not going to go fully into this problem, but the idea of nature, not a strong moral appeal for Jews, very important for Catholics. The idea of nature as giving us moral direction might or might not be true. It hasn't been true in the past. It is not necessarily a Disneyland sort of place. And the idea that the self is a self because a blastocyst is like an embryo which exists in nature, which has a certain fate, may or may not be a useful argument. There is the problem of liberty. Historically, our freedom and our self was linked to the idea that we were privately in charge of this. There was autonomy that was also spatial as well as temporal, that meant that the will could be of anything, and this too has been destabilized. The translation that we Californians love, as we can tell, is that anything could be anything, right? A bodybuilder could be governor, so there you go. And modernity itself raises new challenges. It's hard to live now in a tragic and terrifying history. The Shoah did happen. Molecular biologists and geneticists did go awry. And the future is terrifying. We don't know what will happen. Some bioethicists tragically make a living going around telling us the sky will fall and telling us it's going to be awful. But truly, we don't know if the future is going to be terrible or if it's going to be glorious. That's what it means to stand in a world that is already quite fallen and still proceed. 3 arguments that I might suggest for you. Actually, there were 4, look at that. First of all, we do have discernment. Rules about moral status, and I am finishing, are arbitrary, but we do live by them. This is why we can get haircuts, right? And therefore not slippery slopes. We do change rules when new facts emerge. It went by fast, but some of you got it. We make artificial rules about biological terrain all the time. We do it all the time. Healing and curing might be ontological. The face of the other, says Emmanuel Levinas, is prior to my freedom. And that face being prior to my freedom might translate as face being prior to the self, the other being prior to me. There is no descent, there is no self, perhaps, in this sort of world. There is only alterity. There is only the otherness. Because what a tragic world it would be if one only thought of the self. The world in postmodern Jewish philosophy is an unstable world. It is as if you are on one foot all the time unless you put the foot down in the gesture towards the other. The self only defined by that gesture. This deconstructive narrative of being means the arguments that were relied on as truth claims, way too late for that. Sperm and egg and women's bodies can come from different places and can be brought together in different ways. And the narrative can be deconstructed into many sorts of families and many sorts of readings. There's an open reading frame, not only for science, but now for the Genesis narrative of the self. And the being of different texts, in many different texts, has been reinterpreted under this. Levinas would suggest that we might move towards the idea of hospitality. And I just want to try this out. If we understand that modernity has allowed a failure of a premise of stability and structure and totality into a permanent sort of state of exile, that's the proper state of being, is exilic, not yet redeemed, then in fact the moral self might be the way that it is because we have been brought to this point as a truth claim. That in the way that we understand the world as atomic, we might understand the self as seriously pluripotent. Therefore, the artificial shadow of liberal theory is only seen as an artifice. That beyond that shadow is a turn to ethics in which, in an unstable and transformative world, an interrupted world, this very self might allow us only the claim of possibility. So while providing ethical, political, social frames for science policy, I'm going to argue that moral status questions are ultimately a faith determination, in the same way that philosophy, while true, always has its discontents. Pragmatic solutions, then, that we turn to may be largely procedural, it is true, and not substantive, but could be understood as all that we can do now. And the texts that we turn to need further interpretation. The text, the community, as well as the selves, understood as pluripotent. I want to give thanks, as scientists have taught me to do, to the many people that make such a talk possible, and these are just a few of them. And I want to thank the organizers of this conference for allowing me to try out some of these ideas about postmodern selfness and pluripotency of the self on all of you today. Thank you.
According to the title of this conference, we are here this afternoon to grapple with one question: when does human life begin? To contribute to this ongoing discussion and to try to foster debate, I will describe a conceptual framework that uses recent insights from systems biology to describe human life in the process of embryogenesis. I believe that this framework, which I call the systems perspective, will allow us to better understand many of the entities and the events at the beginning of life. It also provides us with a scientific and philosophical foundation for all our moral and legal discussions on the nature of the human embryo. I will begin with an overview of this new and for most people still unfamiliar perspective. I will then use it to provide a descriptive account of the beginning of life. Finally, I will argue that the systems perspective brings clarity to three controversies within the bioethical literature surrounding the nature of the embryo. So let's start. The systems perspective begins with systems biology. So we have to start there. What is systems biology? It is an emerging field of research that seeks to understand the living whole as a dynamic network of integrated parts. Its goal is to uncover the fundamental design principles of living systems by looking at what system theorists call a system structure and its dynamics. An analysis of a system structure identifies all the parts of the system and then describes their interactions. In biology, this would involve cataloging all of the molecules that go into assembling a living organism and then determining which ones interact with each other. An analysis, on the other hand, of the system's dynamics focuses on the behavior of these interacting molecules over time. In biology, this would involve questions regarding growth, development, and maintenance of the living system. As system biologists have made clear, however, the structure and the dynamics of a living system are inseparably interdependent. A living system is always molecules in motion. We are all molecules in motion, and as Laurie Zola said, we are all atoms at the end of the day. The two insights of systems biology that are of particular interest to us here this afternoon are its emphasis on the holism of the living organism and on the determinism of animal development. Now first, the emphasis on holism. Consider the human body. Consider your body. The most common view is to see the human being as a collection of organs working together under the sway of the central nervous system. Another approach is to see the body as an organized collection of 73 trillion different kinds of cells. Nerve cells, heart cells, skin cells, just to name a few of the approximately 260 different kinds of cell types in our body. All of these work together in an organic whole. However, I would like to suggest that the more radical perspective offered by systems biology is to see the human organism as a dynamic, complex, and seamlessly integrated network not of organs, nor of cells, but of molecules. These molecules include DNA, RNA, proteins, lipids, amongst others, connected by reaction pathways which generate shape, mass, energy, and information transfer over the course of a human lifetime. In contrast to the prevailing reductionistic and mechanistic view, the organism is seen here as a single unified whole. It is a complex and dynamic network of interacting molecules that appear and then disappear in time. It is an embodied process that has both spatial, we get fat, and temporal manifestations, we get old. To illustrate this holistic perspective, we turn to a symphonic orchestra. One way to view a classical orchestra would be to say that it is made up of 4 groups of musicians playing a type of instrument: woodwind, brass, percussion, or string. Another is to say that it is made up of approximately 90 musicians. The systems view would be to see it as a single dynamic network of interacting parts, where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Since each musician has an instrument and a score, the orchestra at a minimum has 270 parts, all organized and seamlessly integrated into a single unity that produces music. In fact, from the systems perspective, an orchestra is not truly an orchestra until its parts begin to interact with one another. That is, when it is performing a symphony. Therefore, to see the living organism as a dynamic system is to see it as a symphonic whole, where DNA, RNA, lipid, and protein molecules, like musicians and their instruments, appear and then disappear on a stage in the choreographed performance called life. Next, systems biology also underscores the deterministic nature of animal development. In this, there is a crucial difference between an orchestra and an organism. One orchestra can play many symphonies because the musical score determines how and when the different parts will interact. In other words, the same structure can give rise to different dynamics. The same parts of one orchestra can interact in different ways to produce either Beethoven's 9th or Mozart's Symphony No. 40. Thus, one cannot predict the future performance of an orchestra from simply studying its parts. It is an indeterminate system. An organism, on the other hand, is a deterministic system that follows a particular species-specific developmental trajectory. In other words, there is a causal relationship between the past, present, and future states of a living system because the molecular composition of the organism constrains the possible sequence of ordered transformations through which the living system can advance. To put it another way, the structure of a living system determines its dynamics. A puppy cannot grow into an ostrich. In this deterministic view, an organism changes and progresses through a sequence of ordered molecular changes because each subsequent step in a reaction pathway is driven by the products of the previous step. Consequently, from the system's perspective, every developmental change, including the teething of an infant or the sexual maturation of a teenager, can be traced to necessary transformations in the molecular composition of that particular human individual. In the end, the trajectory of animal development is like a falling chain of molecular dominoes that manifests itself as outward physical changes in the organism. Once the process begins, it is a self-driven, self-perpetuating chain reaction of molecular transformation that continues throughout the lifespan of the animal. In sum, the system's perspective challenges us to see living organisms as single embodied systems of molecules undergoing both spatial and temporal change. Now, before moving to a descriptive account of the beginning of life from the system's perspective, I need to make one crucial distinction. This is the distinction between a cell and an organism. Now, in most biology textbooks, how many of you here are not biologists? Raise your hand. But I'm sure in high school you had a biology textbook with a picture of a cell. And in that picture you usually see the cell as a structure made up of parts including a nucleus, the cytoplasm, the mitochondria, the endoplasmic reticulum, and the list goes on. However, from the system's perspective, the cell is a three-dimensional constellation of interacting molecules that gives it its structure and its function. Like an organism, it too is an embodied process. But if the cell and the organism are embodied processes, how then are they different? In essence, the former, the cell, is dependent upon the latter, the organism. The human cell as a living system cannot survive on its own. It requires the human organism for its existence. Even when isolated in a tissue culture dish, the human cell relies upon a human organism, usually the lab tech, to maintain the appropriate laboratory conditions it needs to live. Now, in contrast, the human organism is self-sustaining and able to survive as an independent entity throughout its lifespan. Now, notice that the independence of a self-sustaining organism does not mean that it is autonomous or self-sufficient. Most organisms, sometime during their lifetime, depend upon others of their own kind for their own survival. The unhatched chick relies on the hen. The jackal pup relies upon its parents. And the human being, whether embryo, fetus, infant, or toddler, depends upon other human beings for his or her survival. In fact, the same can be said about adult human beings. All of us are relatively dependent upon each other. Think about it. Who prepared your lunch today so that you could eat and survive? Did you go out and catch that chicken? At this point, we are ready to look at fertilization and embryogenesis. As the title of the conference has it, when does human life begin? We begin with the human egg, or the oocyte. The egg is a cell. Most of the egg is composed of a cytoplasm that is chock full of numerous molecules. If the egg were to encounter viable sperm, these molecules would support the process of fertilization and the first two cell divisions of a future embryo. Until fertilization, however, the mature human egg is a living system in stasis, a state called meiotic arrest. In a sense, the egg is a structured collection of inert molecules awaiting activation. Work over the last 2 decades has shown that a key regulator that maintains the meiotic arrest of the egg is a molecule called cyclin B. In this frozen state, the egg only has a lifespan of about 24 hours once it is expelled by the ovary. It cannot maintain itself and soon depletes its energy resources. If it is not fertilized, the system will deteriorate, collapse, and the egg will die. From the system's view, fertilization, the fusion of egg and sperm, has 2 effects. First, it introduces new paternally derived molecules into the network of maternally derived molecules that constitutes the egg. Thus, the composition of the system is radically altered. Indeed, since it has a new structure, it is now a new system. As explained above, however, the structure and the behavior of a deterministic living system are necessarily linked. Thus, fertilization also triggers a change in the dynamics of the egg. It reorganizes and activates the interconnected network of inert maternal molecules in its contents. Now, if left alone, this self-driven, self-perpetuating process of molecular interactions will continue for 9 months and beyond, transforming the living system called an embryo into a howling 8-pound baby. Whereas the living system before fertilization only had a lifespan of 24 hours or so, the new living system after fertilization now has a lifespan of 70 years, or 80 for those who are strong. Furthermore, this new system is capable of relatively independent and self-sustaining existence. It is an organism. Fertilization is the paradigmatic example of the cell-to-organism transition in biology. In sum, from the system's perspective, the beginning of life should be understood first and foremost as the transformation of one dynamic system, the egg, into another, the embryo. The egg is a cell, an embodied process in stasis that only has a life expectancy on the order of hours because it itself is not self-sustaining. It is unable to meet the energy demands needed for long-term survival. In contrast, the embryo is an organism, an embodied process that has a life expectancy in the order of decades, precisely because it has the capability to sustain itself as a relatively independent entity. It is a dynamic system that arises from the necessary interactions among the mix of molecules that is created by the fusion of the egg and the sperm, and it manifests itself as the visible and morphological changes that we call embryogenesis and human development. Now, the system's perspective I have just described can bring some clarity to 3 controversies within the bioethical literature regarding the nature of the human embryo. First, in recent years, some bioethicists have questioned the proposition that fertilization is that moment which properly marks the beginning of the organism. They argue that scientists define fertilization as a complex sequence of coordinated events that begins with sperm penetration and ends some hours or even days later with the union of the pronuclei of the sperm and the egg. Thus, they conclude that fertilization cannot be one single moment, it is a process. In response, the system's perspective highlights the seamless unity of the developmental process that begins with fertilization and ends with death. It sees the distinction between sperm penetration, union of the pronuclei, and any of the later events in embryogenesis as conventional and arbitrary designations of points within a single continuum of developmental change. Recall that all of these morphological markers are simply manifestations of an ongoing process of molecular change. Thus, fertilization from the system's view is properly that moment when the whole chain of molecular events is set in motion, when the organism comes to be. It can be compared to the toppling over of the first domino that begins the collapse of a branching chain of 10 billion dominoes. If one had to pick a biological event to correspond to this falling first domino, it is properly the interaction of the sperm with the egg that leads to the explosion of intracellular calcium levels that triggers the reorganization of the egg's molecular network. Prior to this, the egg was a living system in stasis. After this, it is a different system undergoing change that can continue in normal development unhindered for 100 years. Furthermore, this suggests that any procedure that reorganizes the molecular network within the egg such that it is able to manifest the developmental dynamics associated with our species-specific developmental change would be analogous to fertilization. Fertilization is only one way, the most common and natural way of making a mammalian embryo. Second, the system's perspective highlights the individuality of the embryo from the very beginning. Biologically, individuality is defined by the presence of body axes, the coordinate system that tells the organism where is up and down, left and right, front and back. I'm an organism precisely because I'm organized. If you took an equivalent number of cells that look like me and you just piled them up on here on the floor, it wouldn't be an organism. It wouldn't be a human organism, precisely because it was not organized in the way that I and you are all organized. We have tops and bottoms, lefts, rights, fronts, and backs. Now, all multicellular organisms have at least one of these axes. Most have all three. Body axes are significant because they establish the blueprint for the organism's body plan. They manifest the intrinsic biological organization that makes an organism an integrated whole. They are the sign that the embryo is a single molecular system, not just an embryo, but you and me as well. Significantly, recent experimental work from 2 independent laboratories in the United Kingdom has demonstrated that the embryonic axes are already present in the one-celled mammalian embryo. In fact, one laboratory at the University of Cambridge, the laboratory of Magdalena, Goertz, has good data that indicates that the mammalian embryonic axes are specified by the sperm entry point. In other words, the mammalian embryo uses the sperm entry point to determine top and bottom. This discovery undermines the arguments of those who have argued that the early human embryo is not properly a human being because it does not possess individuality. Finally, the system's perspective allows one to see that calling the human organism an embryo, a blastocyst, a fetus, infant, teenager, or an adult is to arbitrarily label and distinguish certain segments of a continuous chain of developmental events that do not differ in kind. Each is a different manifestation of the same living system. Each is a different manifestation of the same organism at a later stage of change. Once fertilization or any other cell-to-organism transition occurs, the living system does not require further information to complete development. In support of this holistic perspective, recent research has shown that the axes of the embryo, the coordinate system which tells the embryo which is top, bottom, left, or right, have now been implicated in establishing the axes of the fetus, suggesting that continuity exists between the one-celled embryo, the fetus, the newborn, and therefore the adult. The embryo is the same individual human organism, the same living system as the mature adult it will develop into. Now, what are the implications of this? Much effort has recently gone into trying to rationally discern those properties, usually mental properties, whose acquisition transforms a human organism into a human person with moral status. However, I question the rationale of these attempts. They fail to acknowledge the biological integrity and continuity of the human organism made clear by systems biology. To distinguish human beings and human persons is to fall into a dualistic anthropology that in the eyes of many philosophers of all stripes today is simply untenable. To put it another way, all attempts to distinguish human beings from human persons using mental properties forget that human persons are not just minds. We are embodied beings. Thus, our personhood and our bodies are inseparable. Think about it. When we are sick, we do not say, "My body is sick." We say, "I am sick." When someone hits us, we do not say, "Don't hit my body." Instead, we say, "Don't hit me." Our identity, our personhood, has a bodily dimension. Thus, a proper understanding of personhood has to appreciate that wherever our bodies are, there we are as well. You can't be here and your body in the restaurant down the hallway. More important for our purposes, a proper understanding of personhood would acknowledge that whenever our bodies were, there we were as well. And if there is anything that developmental biology and the systems perspective has shown us over the last few decades, it is that our bodies originate at the cell-to-organism transition, which normally takes place at fertilization. Thus, a human embryo is a person because it is the same embodied being as it is when it is an adult. The most critical transformative event in the life cycle of any animal. Indeed, the only rationally discernible and non-arbitrary event that makes it an animal is the cell-to-organism transition. In summary, the systems perspective I have described today takes insights from the emerging discipline of systems biology in our post-genomic age and allows us to describe the events at the beginning of life in such a way that several facts emerge. First, it underscores the importance of the cell-to-organism transition in the development of life. Fertilization, somatic cell nuclear transfer, and recently parthenogenesis are different examples of this transition. Second, it highlights the individuality of the embryo from the very beginning. Third, it reminds us that the embryo is simply an arbitrary label given to the earliest stage of a self-driven, self-perpetuating chain of reaction of molecular transformation that continues throughout the lifespan of the animal. Thus, the human embryo is the same organism as the mature adult. To deny this, to make distinctions between human beings who are non-persons and human beings who are persons, is to fall prey to a philosophically unsound dualistic anthropology. Thank you.
I think before I launch in, it doesn't make a lot of sense to talk about the status of human embryos unless we're all agreeing that we're worried about this because we're talking about doing research on human embryos, whether it be for embryonic stem cell research or other things. So they're, for me, linked together. We wouldn't be having the conversation otherwise, I don't think. So to help understand that, let me spend a few minutes talking about the policy history of how we've dealt with embryo research. And the first thing I want to say, and in a way it's in a response to Jeff Drazen's question after Lori's talk, is what we're interested in or concerned about when we're talking about public policy. What are its goals? And when I talk about public policy or policy more generally, it's not just governmental, it's institutional policy. At my own institution, the University of Minnesota, we've had many conversations, lots of discussion by ad hoc panels, by senior administrators about local policies, local rules for how we will and won't do embryo research. So I think we have to be sure to understand we're talking about policy at a variety of levels. But the goals, I think we can all agree in our society at least, is to articulate acceptable and unacceptable actions. And we try to make rules that prevent unethical behavior and thereby allow ethical behavior. So that's sort of one of the goals of public policy, obviously not the only one. And in this debate, we're really arguing about the status of the human embryo because there's such a diverse set of opinions about answering that question, and therefore the policies, the rules that will devolve from however we answer the question that's the core of today's discussion. So on one end of the spectrum, we have effectively the argument that Father Nick was making, which is from the moment of fertilization, we have a person. If that's a fair, very few word articulation of your view. That's one end of the spectrum. And on the other end would be something we haven't really heard yet, but the idea that early stage embryos are really just a collection of cells. They're tissue. That's the widest range of perspectives I think we can offer about what this debate really entails. So that's obviously a huge gulf between those two views. And I would argue we can learn from the policy history in this area about how we've answered, maybe not perfectly, but we've given some kind of moral answer to the question about whether human embryos at an early stage are mere tissue or are human persons. So let me spend a few minutes talking about that history. We've had a ban on federal funding for research that harms or destroys human embryos since the early 1980s. This goes back to the Reagan administration, the first Reagan administration, which is part of why the announcement by Nancy Reagan is so powerful. So the earliest policy in this area really came maybe a little bit before, but really out of the Reagan administration, and it persists to the present, as we all are aware, I would guess. Don't have to spend time on that. We had a similar policy, which I'm sure most of you know about, that also banned the use of federal monies for research involving discarded fetal tissue, that is, the byproduct of abortions. Started from the same period, was changed, lifted in 1993, driven by an idea, a sense that there was very promising research in the area of Parkinson's, fetal tissue transplant surgery into the brains of patients with Parkinson's from animal models, plus very strong advocacy leading to a change. Now, why is that important? Because it offers us, I think, a concrete way of seeing where the moral argument came. So the decision to seek an abortion, an elective abortion in the fetal tissue regs, must be made separate from the decision to donate the tissue from that abortion. So separating out the two decisions. Abortion separate from decision to donate. So they can't be linked up. Nobody makes any money in the process. And here's the important one for the embryo research debate, as we'll see. There can be no incentive to seek abortion. That is, you cannot direct the donation of that tissue. If my mother needed a fetal tissue transplant, I couldn't, with my wife, get pregnant, have an abortion, and then use that tissue to treat her. That's not legal. That's actually a violation of federal law. Okay? So the decisions have to be distinct. Now, it turns out that we've come to this issue about the use of human embryos at least a couple times in the last 10 or 15 years, who have made recommendations to the government that are very close to the fetal tissue regs in their principle. All right, so the two panels that you see listed here, the HERP, which is the Human Embryo Research Panel, Clinton administration panel, as well as the National Bioethics Advisory Commission, also Clinton-era Bioethics Commission, the predecessor to the President's Bioethics Council, which now sits, both recommended that there be a distinction about using embryos that were made by IVF for reproductive purposes, left over, not needed for reproduction, and therefore potentially usable for research, versus making embryos specifically for the purpose of research. So again, it's a separation of the decision about making embryos from their use. Separating the decision about having an abortion from the donation of the tissue. There's the parallel for you. So it focuses, the Human Embryo Research Panel and NBAC's recommendations focus on the decision about the path to the potential person, to take it back to the last two talks. So the person who made the embryo gets to decide about the path to the potential person. It's contrary to what Father Nick laid out for us. They're not a person yet. They don't become a person until sometime later, and the decision about whether that potential gets realized or the path to that potential gets realized is up to the person who made the embryos. Okay, now let me, from that history, make some observations for you. One, and this may be obvious, but I think deserves talking about in the context of today's meeting. Embryo research in the United States remains legal. Right? There is not a law against it. You cannot use federal monies as long, you can use federal monies if you don't harm or destroy embryos, but that's sort of beside the point. Embryo research is legal so long as it's in the private sector. Private funding is used. And that distinction is a somewhat unusual one for the world. The United States is in a way unique in this respect, but that's what we have. Private dollars can be used in ways that public cannot. We do that in a lot of different ways. And that's because of the relationship between Congress and the executive branch. But it was endorsed as a matter of policy the day after President Bush went on TV on August 9, 2001 to announce the embryonic stem cell lines decision, the one we all know about, 9 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, right? There were 60 some odd lines available. No new embryos will be harmed for the purpose of ESL research, at least with federal dollars. Secretary Tommy Thompson, the day after on the PBS NewsHour said, there is no, this is a quote, no limitation on private investment for embryo research. All right, so the government is saying it's not immoral to do it as long as it's with private dollars. So, for me, and I would argue we should talk about this, but the legality of embryo research has moral meaning. All right? Now, we may say that the law is a sort of a poor substitute for morality. I would agree, but it's at some level representative of our morality. And if we think embryo research is morally wrong, that it's like killing people, why hasn't a presidential administration or Congress moved to ban not only federally funded research harming or destroying human embryos, but all ESL research or all embryo research? That's, I think, a question we have to wrestle with. Second, the point I started to make, assuming that our laws at some agreed imperfect level represent our sense of what is right and wrong, what is morally acceptable, the legality of embryo research in the private sector has moral meaning. That's not nothing. It's meaningful. And it's like saying we would never say it's wrong to murder people unless you use private dollars. Right? We have laws that say murder is wrong. We put people in jail for doing it. We don't say if you use public money it's wrong, but if you use private money, go ahead. Okay? So if we thought as a matter of policy that doing research on human embryos was like murdering people, we wouldn't have this private-public distinction. All right? That's one place to leave you. And I'm not making an argument, this is an observation. The second thing, which hasn't been said yet, and I thought I would put it on the table, I'm not sure that I actually believe that this is the way to go, but it may help us, as Evan asked for in his opening remarks, get to some place of conversation. And that is using, again, a complex and not altogether perfect approach to how we think about the end of life and apply that to the beginning of life. So using death by brain criteria and the idea of personhood, albeit the one that Father Nick just rejected outright, but let me offer it as an alternative, as a way of getting us to a point where we can agree potentially about research on human embryos. So can death by brain criteria help in this debate? Just to refresh your minds, in every state in the United States, there is now policy that allows people to be pronounced dead, and in fact they don't have an option, when their brain stops functioning in particular ways. So their heart may still be beating, they may be breathing by aid of a respirator, but they're not considered living persons anymore if their brain has stopped functioning in particular ways. Their personhood is considered gone, and therefore they are considered dead. Now there's a few exceptions to that, but I think that's only confusing to the point I'm trying to make. So we measure a loss of specific kinds of brain activity as a way of determining when personhood is gone. And we should talk about what that means, and there's not enough time, I think, here to do that. I want to try to adhere to my 20 minutes, and hopefully you'll have questions about this. But I would ask whether we shouldn't at least talk about whether the beginning of significant brain development is a good place to look for the beginning of personhood. And personhood being the important place to draw a line between those embryos that deserve moral respect, like you and I, and those that do not. Again, this is contrary to the points that Father Nick made, but is closer to what Lori was arguing. So here is a way to think about life by brain criteria, if you want to just use the parallel from death by brain criteria. So the idea that moral status that comes with personhood comes in conjunction with this notion of life by brain criteria. So when would that start? We have a line drawing problem, right? And that's, I think, part of the attraction of an approach like Father Nick's. We don't have a line drawing problem then. But let's focus on this for a little while. Some important points in brain development, and now I feel like I'm really a fish out of water, knowing that in the audience are people who are neurobiologists, people who know much more about this than I, and hopefully we can use this as a potential starting point, because I would never claim that these are the right kinds of places to draw lines. But here's at least some rough and ready beginning points. So neurons forming in the sort of first structure of the developing brain after the 54th day post-conception. That's a pretty long time. That's certainly post-embryo. Right? You're getting fetal development then. If we want to talk about neural, that means brain neuron synapses, that's after the 70th day post-conception. Differentiation of the neurons, 170, and evidence of function connection between the developing brain and the developing organs, post 240 days. Now that's all quite a long time after what we would consider to be early stage embryos. So people have argued, this is actually an argument that goes way back, goes back to the 80s, that I've just trotted out for you all to look at and shoot at and maybe reject altogether, but I think it's a place to talk. Even drawing the line conservatively about where fetal or developing brain function begins, if we were to say 54, that includes all embryo research, right? Anything after 54 days is not embryonic, it's something else. All right, so that's a way for us potentially to get out of the problem. It's an empirical sort of point to a line determination for what counts as a person. It's full of problems, I would argue, and we'll hear, I bet, about a lot of those problems from our commentators, but in an effort to offer something different than what we've already heard and some empirical kind of line drawing opportunity, I offer that to us all. All right, so let's look forward, and that'll be the end of my slides. In the meantime, I think we have to find some way to proceed in this area of research, and we have found a way, right? We have this sort of in-between public policy approach. Public versus private, you can use public money for certain cell lines, not others. There may be another step or two we might take before we get a resolution, if ever, of this question. So I think, in fact, what will drive the discussion and potential policy change is, again, like the Parkinson's example in fetal tissue research, concrete promise for specific diseases. That's what drives rhetoric, that's what drives advocacy, that's what changes thinking in the policy arena. It tips the scales, if you will. So the moral cost of doing this research, and I think we should think about it that way, gets tipped by the benefits that can be offered. It's quite utilitarian, but that's the way policy often gets made. And so think about things like juvenile diabetes. Orrin Hatch has publicly said that the thing that really changed his mind was a little boy who was brought to his office in Washington, sat on his lap, and told the story of his own life with juvenile diabetes, type 1 diabetes. And he had a mind change at that point, said Senator Hatch. So that's about advocacy and rhetoric and very specific, concrete kinds of potential benefit. The second thing that may help is this idea of a Chinese wall, which, you know, we sort of set up a barrier between making things like human embryos and then their subsequent use. I say Chinese wall because people, you know, sort of, you can't unring the bell. If they hear that that's possible, it's not as if they're making decisions in a true vacuum, but that's a way to help distinguish between making embryos merely for research and making them for some other purpose and having them left over. And then, as I just have finished saying, the parallels between death by brain criteria and potentially using that as a way of talking about life by brain criteria may actually help us determine acceptable, morally acceptable public policy around research on human embryos. And then the very, very last thing, which is unrelated to anything I've said here, but I think an important one to take away from a discussion like this is, in fact, we're much better off if you think that we need oversight of this area of science and control and hard looks at it from people in the public sector. The best way to do that is to spend money on it, spend our public money on it. Because with public rules come, with public money, come public rules. And we live in a way now in a black hole of what the private sector is doing because there are no rules because there's so little public money. So with that, I'll stop. I think I only used my 20 minutes to the dot, and I'll entertain your questions or comments.